Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Medieval Podcast. And I'm joined here with someone who has done many things from archaeology to acting. So, without further ado, please welcome Arun.
Hello. Hi, Luke.
Thank you for coming. So, um, essentially, I like to jump straight into things by really understanding kind of your journey into history, what inspired you to follow your career and get to kind of where you are now.
Well, I think there's been a lot of influences in my life. God, it feels like the Graham Norton show. Um, I would say probably the first influences would be immediate family.
Mm,
So, dad, um, he was a history nut when it came to Mesopotamian history. So he was born in Baghdad. He had friends who spoke Aramaic and all kinds of funny people would come over to smoke the shisha around the table and speak in all sorts of different tongues. I was just a little kid. I was like, "What's going on?" It just smelled like cigars and and whiskey. But yeah, I think that was one of the sort of the first things that probably influenced me. And then movies,
nice.
big time movies. I mean, I suppose Indiana Jones is the usual go-to, right?
Oh,
But I
yes.
think for me, I probably started off with dinosaurs first.
Okay.
So it was Jurassic Park. I was mad about that. Um, then I found out you had to study for like years and years and years to become a paleontologist. I was
Yeah.
like, scary. So then I got into watching mummy movies, the old Boris Karloff movies and the ones
Yeah.
like The Mummy's Shroud. There's this one where this mummy crumbles his head down at the end, which I thought was really weird. I still remember that. And yeah, kind of a bunch of different things like that. They just got me sort of visually interested in it, and like Jason and the Argonauts, the old
Mm,
sort of the squidgy not dinosaurs, squidgy skeletons and things kind of fighting each other. Um, yeah, and then I suppose reading like Greek myths. I can't remember the author's name, but there's a book called The Greek Myths, Robert something. And yeah, I just used to read that before I went to sleep at night. And then that kind of just gradually evolved. And at school, I took Latin for a tiny bit. Found that quite challenging. Uh,
yeah.
and then I just got really interested in going deeper into like, full on Iliad, Odyssey, the
Mm,
Aeneid, all the sort of classical epics. I mean, I was brought up with my other side of my family is Asian Indian. So I was brought up with the Mahabharata and all of that kind of thing, the Ramayana, all of these big battles and
yeah.
epic heroes and stuff. Um, yeah, for a while I wanted to be Hercules after watching Hercules: The Legendary Adventures.
Nice.
I still
Nice.
remember the entire theme and the voiceover in the beginning of it, but that was one of my favorite shows as a
Mm.
kid.
Now, this is something
Yeah.
sorry, this is something that I do find really interesting about kind of your, I guess, your story, your life in that sense, is because there is this kind of consistent escapism into kind of Latin, Greek history from an early age through to university. What is
Mm.
it about this era? You say about all these heroes and everything. What is it about that kind of you find gets you going?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's the sort of mystery of it,
Mm,
right? There's a bit of mystery and magic to it. And there was something very attractive about, these sort of individuals going through these very testing times and coming out, well, not always coming out stronger, but hopefully sometimes coming out stronger.
yeah.
Um, but I think I was just attracted to all of these monsters, these kind of fights between monsters. I wanted to battle a Hydra, but unfortunately there aren't any around. Maybe politically, but not
Yeah. Yeah.
really. I think yeah, escapism is one word for it, I suppose. I just found it a lot more enjoyable to visualize,
Mm,
right? A lot of the things that, like, even when you go into when you're reading books in, English class or whatever, it can kind of ruin the passion for the story because you're analyzing the thing to death, and you break it down and you have to figure out this stuff and then write essays about it. And I think there was this kind of like love-hate relationship with wanting to study the classics and those sort of connected things, because I really enjoyed looking into them on my own.
Mm.
But when I had to study them,
Yeah,
I got a little put off because it was so clinical,
I get you.
and
Mm.
it kind of removed the human from the whole thing,
Yeah,
and the very thing that I sort of just wanted to connect with. I guess I just found them quite inspirational, some of these stories, right? I think it is that whole thing of, the individual overcoming adversity, or um, you know, defying the gods, that kind of thing. Maybe the superhero syndrome was implanted in my brain at a young age. Uh, yeah, I think that's kind of like the trite answer to that question. Yeah.
yeah. But I guess what's then interesting is that you do end up um, transitioning into the academic world
Mm.
in doing classical history through a master's, and the outcome of this is then your dissertation, which is absolutely fascinating, redefining a Neolithic human-horse interactions in Central Eurasia. Something incredibly specific, not something that I've certainly ever touched upon, and I'm not sure many people would have. So, how did you kind of find your way into that? And then, could you also summarize kind of what you were looking for?
Yeah, well, I kind of have a lot of crazy ideas swimming around in my head, sometimes all at the same time, sometimes at different moments. And this was one of those things I just felt the need to try and attempt.
Mm,
Um, I think there was a lot of stuff that was bugging me about mm, how people approach nature, right?
mm,
Especially like in the academic side of things. Again, clinical,
yeah,
taking away that sort of like personal connection from things. Um, and in terms of, I mean, I was very, very into sort of Central Asian prehistory for a while. So, Bronze Age, pre-Achaemenid stuff. That kind of was because I looked at Alexander the Great's campaigning in Central Asia initially. That was my dissertation in undergraduate. Um, but like going sort of pulling up those threads and looking further back in time, you then get to these sorts of periods where people are trying to posit when these animals are domesticated. The Central Asia just becomes like a giant stables, for some people. They
mm,
forget all the culture there and they just think people running around with lassos trying to tame something. Um, and I think I just got a bit annoyed at that because like my granddad, he used to train horses at a stables years and years ago. He was never very much into these sort of domineering methods of control or training or sort of beating the spirit out of the animal. I think he was sort of more of the thinking of trying to develop a partnership with him,
right,
trying to find a mutual relationship that it evolves into something that's kind of um, beneficial for both parties, right? So it's not just the human jumping on its back.
mm,
And in all of these interpretations of horse domestication, it was all just very much about practical. It's all about practical. It's as if like, yeah, someone just woke up one morning and thought, oh, I'm going to control this thing.
mm,
And does that really stand up to scrutiny? And I knew a little bit of sort of the historical period in North America beforehand, and it's kind of a little bit about the introduction of horses. But I think there was just a niggling thing inside of me that it was just moving away from what to me feels like the point of archaeology, which is to get into the mind of people from before.
mm,
As much as it is to develop all of the sort of material side of things and fill in the gaps, I want to know why. Why?
yeah,
That's the big scary question, the squidgy question, where you can't really, open an Excel spreadsheet and fill in all of the little cells. It's something that is undefined.
yeah,
And I think that's why it's sort of important to try and, hone that and narrow that down to something a little bit more tangible. But we have so many examples today of how tangible that is, how it is possible to create a relationship with an animal that doesn't depend on just a sort of a unilinear approach, a one size fits all, and this is the only way that works. Yeah, I don't know if
Yeah,
I
I think
answered your question fully, but
no, that's perfect. And I think what's really interesting about that, and I think of my own perceptions, is that domestication, especially of horses in history, I've always kind of seen it in this kind of scientific sense as of like a one and done. We domesticated horses, we created fire, all this different, like, it's just a step. But what then reading your research became more apparent is that it wasn't just this kind of one and done thing, that actually it is, like you say, a relationship, and that you can even regress because you can have de-domestication. So could you speak a bit about, I guess, how wrong my perception is and also what this idea of de-domestication is in that sense?
okay. I think firstly, I'll just say that there's nothing wrong in terming this domestication. No, it's a phrase we have, it's a term we have.
Mm.
You know, for all intents and purposes, personally, I would have rather not have even used the word in my research, but
Really?
you have to use a label in order to unpick it, right? You have
Mm.
to sort of have some anchoring things. Um, it's a tricky one because it does bring up all of this, a whole load of baggage, with a colonial approach to things. And again, colonial doesn't necessarily mean Western Europe.
Mm.
And when I say Eurocentric and different things, it doesn't necessarily attribute to a visual appearance or a part of the world.
Yeah.
Certainly not today. It's something that is becoming a bit more widespread. So in terms of domestication being wrong, I would just say there's different versions and different perceptions. And it's not, I mean, that term itself should really have a lot of different nuances to it, a lot of different gradations to get to the final thing. But like what we call domestication, in England will be very different to what someone 500 years ago in the Northern Plains would have called
Mm.
domestication, if there was even a term for it. And I
Yeah.
think that's something to think about, is that while we might want to refer to something as being domesticated 5,000-6,000 years ago, is that really what was going on in the person's mind when they were looking at the animal?
Mm.
Were they really thinking, I'm going to domesticate you? And I think that brings in this idea again of this sort of linear trajectory, as if everything in history is just going in a straight line up to this golden point in time where we are
Yeah.
at now, dubious though that is. um, I think that it's this idea as well that domestication is a hallmark of civilization. It's a pinnacle of excellence that
Mm.
makes us separate things from other things. It means we can label ourselves as better than. And I suppose what I'm just trying to suggest is that it's not better, it's just different.
Yeah.
you know and I know that, like, diversity is a bit of a buzzword these days, but genuinely, in a very sincere way, diversity in the archaeological record, and in cultures and cultural approaches and
Yeah.
attitudes to nature is something that you don't often find the further back you look at human history. It
Mm.
seems to be this like primordial pool of like one thought, which is just ugh ugh,
Yeah. Yeah.
that then develops into a few more letters until you have an alphabet. But like, yeah, I just feel like it's a lot of different. I keep using that sort of like analogy of threads, right? I feel like archaeology is sometimes trying to track an animal through time. You only have the little footprints left. You don't know exactly what it was, but you try and detect what it is. And okay, I know that the weight of the pressure on that little thing suggests it might have been older, whatever. But at the end of all of that, you still need to use your intuition as a hunter,
Mm.
to be able to find that animal, because these tracks will only tell you so much. then it's those other things. And I feel like it's intuition that helps to guide you towards that squidgy side of the past, where these old threads are, pulling them up, pulling them back, finding where they go, and then seeing that some of these threads go back to a very, very ancient past that then shows it's not a primitive one. But then some of these threads only go back 20, 30 years, 120, 100, 200 years, and they're more about us today. And I think, like, for me, separating what is the important things for us today to what might have been important to people in a different time, that just helps me to think about domestication as it's different priorities, different different sets of agendas, and de-domestication. That was, sorry, very long-winded
No,
answer thing,
perfect.
but de-domestication, this is something I came across in one of the articles I was researching, and it was effectively just a different kind of, it was a two different sort of sets of horses, two different kind of like control groups. One was put in the woods, one was taken out. To cut a long story short, what the eventual analysis was that while horses that were used to being with people from an early age were more amenable to them throughout life, and horses that were not introduced to people from an early age were in the forest group, but had to interact with people later on in life, they weren't so, happy about it. There were still horses in between that were actually friendly regardless of their upbringing. Right. And their sort of suggestions at the end was that, it's going back to that behavioral familiarity, that sort of taming, that if these animals are friendly basically from being used to being with humans, then if you just separated that contact, that would gradually dissipate. And I mean, you see that in horses in feral herds, after, a bunch has been released for a little bit of time, within a generation, suddenly they're acting within their own natural bounds, their own natural processes of thinking. You see that with cattle, in some of the islands of, I think it's the Outer Hebrides, I can't remember where it is. There was a bunch of cattle that's been let loose for about 50 years and has now gone, back to its own way of doing things. And interestingly, even looking slightly different as well. So, plastic characteristics, slightly longer, shaggier coats. And so that, I mean, not to go into the genetic angle here too much, but it does start to challenge, again, this, another hallmark of domestication is this breeding control, controlling the genetics, making sure that what you have is exactly how you want it. It's like just a control over the life cycle of the animal. But yeah, these sorts of examples show that regardless of what you do to those genes, I know that's a rather cringy thing to say from Jurassic Park, but what does it say? Life finds a way, and life does find a way.
Yeah.
It always does. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think what's brilliant there is, and this is something that I found that was throughout your whole research, is this differing of perspectives. And one of the key things that you talk about is kind of going away from this Eurocentric view and looking at the mind of someone back then, is then looking at the spiritual perspectives that are key in domestication, especially when you move away from this idea of man conquering beast and you look at it in a more kind of spiritual way. Could you tell us a bit more about those spiritual aspects within domestication, and the ideas that then inform the process?
Yeah, totally. I think let's set up the sort of general notion today that relationships to most animals are kind of, free from those religious or spiritual kind of connotations for the most part in the Western world. Of course, there's other aspects where they are, and pets are different, for different people. But like in terms of, milking your cow and, getting eggs from your chicken, it's pretty much a practical boom, let's get the stuff done and get what we want. So seeing that as our kind of priority today, okay, generalizing it, but seeing that as a priority today, looking back in the past, and again seeing diversity in regions as well as cultures, and within cultural groups as well, diversity, different individuals doing different things. The way of mediating that relationship with, let's say, nature, not just the animal, but nature as a whole, as a thing. Um, it's facilitated through perceptions of it, perceptions that are imbued with a kind of holiness, a thought of there being something special to it, something important, something maybe divine to it. And this isn't stuff that's some philosopher sits down and thinks about, and then everyone goes, oh, that's a good idea. For some societies, this is, you're born into it, and this is genuinely what is believed. This is something that is tangibly real. And everything in that natural orbit, it isn't necessarily a separate thing from the human. I mean, if we're talking about those Archaeologist herders in Mongolia, the domestic sphere is embedded within the landscape, and those animals that are in that landscape cross between and throughout those spheres of interaction. They're not just stuck in one area with a fence around them. They have an agency to move. And I think it's that respecting of agency, which is a very important aspect of this sort of spiritual dialogue with nature, which is that these animals, I mean, plants as well, all of these different facets of nature have agency. They have an ability to hold their own ground and decide what they want to do with the human being. It's not just the human being, I will do this to you and then you will respond. The modern, very mechanical approach to things, like pressing a button and getting a feedback from it. Whereas these relationships are negotiated constantly, and they're negotiated through these, different rituals, different formats with different cultures as well. If you're looking at the Northern Plains, you have slightly different variations between, the Blackfoot nations, the Hidatsa, and then if you go down south, the Comanche as well, there might be some similarities, but there's also huge variations on a theme, but they're still incorporating horses as well in a spiritual way. But then you have, and again, depending on the culture as well, you have a sort of a grading of those interactions, where some things might take a little bit more priority, where when the horse comes in, whereas other animals might have sort of taken a while to, I mean, this is a bit crass to say, but to sort of rise on those rungs of the ladder. The horse comes in and quite quickly it gets adopted as this very unique, very highly spiritually imbued animal. And I suppose you're also looking at the idea that certain things are imbued with more spiritual energy than others. While everything has it, some things have a higher concentration. You'll see that even just in the anatomy of the animal. So, for example, in Archaeologist in Mongolia, these horses, a very favored stallion or very special animal, a horse that was very loved in the herd. When it dies, the skull is the bit that's seen as the most important part of that animal, and that's the bit that is placed on an ovu or a special place, because that's seen as also representative of its soul, and its power when it was alive. So I would say, yeah, spiritual energy within the natural world is something that's recognized as a sort of having agency as well. So while these animals have their agency, there's a spiritual energy within the natural world that also has an agency. And so it's this kind of I'm going to sound tacky and say this kind of force, but this kind of energy that is also seen as something that has to be revered, sometimes feared, because it can go this way and that way. Sometimes it's given it's anthropomorphized, it's given a kind of a human sort of like face or something like that, but it's still seen as something that's sort of more than human. It's hyperhuman or it's more than human, and it's something that can also dictate the level of energy within these animals. I know that sounds kind of maybe hopefully not too vague, but Yeah, I don't know if that answered your.
No, yeah, it does. And I think
Mm.
it really gives this idea that I think we often give a very simplistic view to kind of hunter gatherers, you know, Neolithic, Bronze Age, these kind of primitive peoples. We got use this idea of primitive, that it's very simplistic, strive to survive. But then you say all this, and it kind of really tells the opposite, that they had highly complex religious systems. There was almost a symbiotic relationship with the landscape around them, with the ecosystem around them. I mean, what do you think? Was it man trying to conquer its surroundings, or was there this deeply interwoven relationship with, I guess, the natural world around them?
Yeah, I think this is an important point to consider. Really, it's possibly a another future piece of research, but I have wondered as well, what is it that has made certain attitudes today the most popular attitudes?
Yeah.
Why those ones, not other ones? What's happened in the process of time, people, and life that has made these ones seem the right way as well?
Mm.
Um, I think you can certainly say that some cultures and some groups throughout time, even today as well, do see sort of an equanimity with the natural world, where it's not so much a hierarchy as opposed to kind of like a um, what's the word, hierarchy, and then you've got kind of like, it's like yeah, an equanimity. So it's like a spectrum, right,
Mm.
and variation on the theme. And then we've got other versions, which is indeed that sort of domination, that desire to control. Um, and I suppose I've wondered, with some of the research I've done for my piece, um, where that sort of trust may have transformed into something else.
Mm.
It's a trust going into a distrust of nature, right? And what is it that's causing that distrust or mistrust?
Yeah.
Is it something reasonable, or is it just a fear of something? You know,
Mm.
what's causing that fear? And I think it's fear that might well be beneath some of these changes, really.
No.
And that's the real thing to interrogate. What what were certain people afraid of? What are we afraid of now?
No, for sure. And it is a
Mm,
fascinating idea, especially in that, like you say, the transformation of, I guess, hunter gatherer societies into what we would call civilization in a way, that there is this transformation from a spiritual harmony to kind of a domination, especially in a Eurocentric view. With, as you say, you start having animal husbandry and this idea of domination and breeding and control. Uh, yeah, I wouldn't even know where to begin in in knowing why that happened. Um, but I guess in
mm,
the meantime, going back to kind of yourself, you have then this academic background and this classical love, but then you transition from the academic to the theatrical.
mhm.
How did that come about, and what is some of the stuff that you've done?
Well, um, I think that came about because I didn't want to go into politics.
Yeah.
I studied politics, well, war, peace, international relations, during my undergraduate. Um, and I was always sort of playing with the idea of going into the creative world. Um, I just didn't have the sort of support earlier to do it, and I didn't have the avenues to go and do it before. But then I just started getting involved in a lot of societies, different sort of drama productions and things at uni. Um, and it was just it felt like it was always like a strong intention of mine since I was a kid.
Mm,
Talking about watching all these movies and things. Something I realized quite early on was that, oh well, I don't have to study paleontology and archaeology and I don't know, being a super secret spy or whatever. If I'm an actor, I can just dip in and out.
mm,
but like I can still get a fulsome view if I commit myself to it and I really see what it's about. And I think that was always something that was important to me, was that I wanted to get a flavor of a lot of different things. I didn't want to just sort of stick to one path and just do that one thing. I've always wanted to sort of juice life for its last drops, really, and try and find out all the different cool things that can be done.
Mm.
And the creative industry, yeah, it has its sort of ups and downs, but it does have that variation and that excitement and that ability to really get involved in things that you might not normally be able to do, and to learn about them, to learn about different lifestyles around the world, to learn about different cultures. And you get to do research as well. You really
Mm.
do. It might not be sort of funded by university, but it's still research, and if you do it properly, it stands up to scrutiny, if you do it properly. And I think there's that attraction to me as well, which is how to get all of this really cool knowledge that we have as academics, all of this like stuff we're swimming in, all of these
Mm.
articles and all of these data sets and whatever, but how do we use that in a way that's actually helpful for everybody, right?
Mm.
How do we bridge that gap between our world and then the rest of the world, which still goes on around us? um and I've always been interested in how to sort of feed this kind of thing into it, this kind
Mm.
of research, this kind of knowledge or database into the creative world, and make it visual, because that's something that I found. Of course, some of those movies I saw as a kid are not entirely accurate, but they certainly piqued my imagination and they got me interested in history. And I think that's where I realized that it's not just dates and numbers and some king did this and some queen did that. There's everything else to it as well, and you don't usually get that. Some books are written very well and you do, but you don't usually get that, certainly in your school system when you're
Mm.
taught it, and you certainly wouldn't if unless you really investigated into it. But I think there is like a big surge now of trying to make it, well, academia, make all of this kind of like knowledge base accessible, um and useful, useful knowledge, stuff that is applicable to the world, that isn't just contained in one little circle for people to pontificate and challenge within their own little man cave or whatever, but something that can be, you know just a bit more of a democratic process, with knowledge. Really, I think that's something that I've seen is really possible with the creative world.
Mm.
um and I think, yeah, otherwise I suppose if you're talking about my journey into it all, um those sorts of thoughts were still developing, I suppose, before I got fully fledged into sort of professional capacity. But then, yeah, I just found it was a bit of a risk, really. I mean, I'd never sort of done any classes, like, like I know some people I know have, they've taken sort of acting classes here and there. Someone just said to me at the end of uni, said, "Oh, hey, you can act. Why don't you try drama school?" And I was always terrified of that idea, because I just thought, oh, I'm just going to be rejected. I don't fit into the conventional categories of what they're looking for. I wouldn't be this, I wouldn't be that, blah, blah, blah. And, much to my surprise, I got in to a few places, and then decided on one place. Um, and it was always a bit of a risk, in that I thought, if I don't get in, I won't pursue it.
Mm.
If this doesn't work, that'll be it. I was kind of the thinking of quite kamikaze, when I was younger. And yeah, I mean, it was tough. There was learning to be learnt. There was stuff to be experienced. Um, but it's like driving a car, right? So they say, once you pass your test, then you learn to drive. It's likewise with acting, right? Once you've gone to acting school, then you learn to act.
Yeah.
And I think it's more those experiences I've had in the industry, where I've actually learned to become a better actor, and learned also what I don't want to do
Mm.
and what I want to do. But it's a whole world and universe of creative potential there. And yeah, dipping in and out of the past to inspire that is really, really important to me. I feel like without that grounding, in history or ancient history, or prehistory, um, that just kind of feeds my imagination, but feeds it in a way that's kind of, yeah, grounded in a reality that
Mm.
has existed at some point. Um, and that just enables me to sort of create something, well, hopefully one day create something that has, again, that sort of useful knowledge in it, something that people can be inspired by, um, and utilize in some way. Um, yeah.
Mm. Yeah, but I think what's really kind of interesting on that front is that even from your research, from kind of the work that you've done and everything previously, there is this underlying theme of differing perspectives of getting into the minds of people from other cultures, other periods, whatever it may be. And so I can definitely see how that kind of then informs then your pursuit to acting. How does then your academic knowledge inform your acting? Do you like to, I guess, kind of leave a bit of space for creativity and imagination, or do you like to stick to the facts as much as you can?
Yeah, very, very good point. I mean, at drama school, we were taught to stick to the facts. Um, but like you see it very often in the media these days,
Mm.
people are kind of like play fast and loose with those facts. Um, and the things that are supposedly historical, then you research them and you go, that didn't happen, did it? Um, I think it depends on the production and the role. If I have control over my character, and if
Mm.
I'm given the kind of the wiggle room to decide and make those decisions, then I think there's always a level of interpretation with anything, whether you are looking at a data set or whether you're looking at a character. You have those facts that are there, and if it's a historical character and it's grounded in a historical reality, that person is dead. You know, their personality you may never really know, and you just have to utilize yourself. That's why you're in the role, is to do justice. It's like being a lawyer in a way. You know,
Mm.
you're doing justice to this character, but then it's also not like a lawyer because then you're also trying to wear their costume as well. um and I feel like it's a play between the two things. You know, I think there's productions these days that will take some liberties, for the sake of just bringing in an audience, you know, just to make it look cool. And then there's productions, I think, that don't get as much funding because they do really try to stick to those facts. But yeah, even if they're facts, you know, a fact is still an interpreted truth from a thing, right? It's still something that you have to extract and turn into something human that then you can utilize. So I think that I've got to be sensitive to the task, to the
Mm.
topic, to the character. Um, Otherwise, if you don't have those facts, then you lose the grounding,
Mm.
and then you can just make whatever you want, and we've seen that in the media. Um, or again, if you get too stuck with those facts, um, you don't give yourself the license to be able to breathe life into it, right? And I think that's where I've seen with other people's work and different historical things where they've played that well, where you know they've given themselves that wiggle room to explore the possibilities of a personality.
Mm.
Um, Otherwise, it is literally just you know, it's like a one of those docudramas, you know. Um, so yeah, I think it's also just gauging what it is you're trying to tell about that person's story.
Mm.
Because in a film and whatever, you can never quite gauge or fit in everything about that person. You might only be able to focus on a few facets of that person, but you still create the rounded character. But then, you know, it's those different parts that may need a little bit of emphasis here or there. But yeah, I think it just varies on who's directing you as well, who's written the thing, and you know what your deadlines are.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I can imagine.
Mm,
So I guess just finally on all that really,
mm.
what does the next year look like for you? Do you have any upcoming projects or research that you'd like to share?
I do have an upcoming project that is in post-production. So we just finished shooting, I think 3 weeks ago now. It is a historical piece set in, yeah, early Middle Ages.
Oh,
Um, and it's a visual poem. It's following a one man's narrative journey through the landscape as he lifts off some demons and buries some things to rest, lays some things to rest. So it's a process of redemption, and yeah, it's quite an intense piece. But this is a sort of, again, we talked a lot about nature. I think that's probably where my inspiration for this film has come from as well, is that I wanted to emphasize nature as the other character, the landscape as the other character. So, you know, it's that interplay. It's the things around him that will trigger him
mm.
to go through certain things that he hasn't quite addressed. But we're talking about a period of upheaval in certain parts of the Mediterranean, and his character has seen those periods and is at the end of that journey, and we find him in the probably the final few weeks of that process.
Oh, sounds
But yeah,
absolutely fantastic.
well, I
When,
can't wait
how
to
will
see the
we be
footage
able to
myself.
watch it? Will we be able to?
Yeah. So editing is starting in earnest this weekend, actually. Um, it's likely to be ready probably early next year because there's a lot of
Mm.
different things, with editing, post production. Also, got to record the voice. Sorry, got to record the voiceover,
Mm.
which is the poem that goes over it. Yeah, there'll probably be a few different cuts. But yeah, we are very ambitious with that project, and hopefully we will get it out there
Well, I wish you
into
all the
different
best.
avenues. I'll let you know as soon as we know.
Please do. No, it does. It sounds fantastic. No, thank you very much for coming on. It's been an absolutely brilliant episode and really interesting to dive into. Like we have your research, but then see how that's informed everything that you've done, really. And this idea, like you say, of this of nature, differing perspectives, and all that comes with that. So, thank you very much for coming on.
You're welcome. It's been great. It's been really
Brilliant.
great.
Thank you for watching, everyone, and catch the next episode coming soon.